Welcome into another edition of the FutureSox RoundUp. My name is Elijah Evans, and I'm joined as always by my co-host Jeff Cohen. We are back. It's been a little bit, offseason has been a little slow so far, I think, around Major League Baseball. Finally, things starting to pick up a little bit in the last week or two. We got some big signings, couple big names off the board, with a lot more to come this coming week. As we record here on Friday the 6th, winter meetings start on Monday. So that's the time where, Major League Baseball owners, agents, teams are all in one place, meeting, going over stuff. There's events going on, but there's also a lot of negotiations happening. The expectation around baseball is that Juan Soto, who, we talked about this, I think, briefly, a lot of the free agency market is just hinging on one player this year, similar to last year with Shohei Ohtani. This year, you've got, Juan Soto, who's going to get probably the second biggest contract ever. There's a chance that he gets as much or more than Ohtani does, honestly. It's going to be crazy. So that's where we're at with that situation. And his decision is expected in the next few days here, and I think that's going to really get free agency rolling here. So we're going to have a lot more trades and free agency and hopefully all that stuff. Garrett Crochet trades like we talked about last episode. That's going to happen at some point, I think. The expectation is that's going to happen at some point. So we're going to have more to talk about. But today we're doing something a little different. We're going to just talk, about the minor leagues, because that's what we do here on the Roundup typically. And we are going to go through our projected starting rotations at each level of the White Sox organization. We're going to talk through kind of which pitchers can start at each level, who's kind of on the edge of levels, who's going to, fly quickly, guys that are probably going to need a whole year at a level. Really just talk through all the starting pitching depth in the White Sox system, which is very strong and fun to talk about. But first of all, Jeff, how you doing? It's been a little bit.
Yeah, it's good to see you. I hope you had a good holiday. And it's the calm before the storm. Soto's apparently going to sign in the next few days. And sounds like Garrett Crochet is going to get traded sooner than later. So a lot of exciting stuff about to happen in baseball.
Yeah, 100%. It's going to be a fun time. But on that note, it's a fun time to project and to think about the White Sox. I think, there's a little more positivity, dare I say, than in the past, year or so. I think there's a little bit. I wouldn't say there's a ton, but I think generally speaking, there is some excitement around the prospects, and around the fact that they're going to be adding more prospects hypothetically in a Crochet trade, right? There's a lot to look forward to in my eyes, at least, and for us, at least on the prospect side, there's definitely a lot to look forward to. The pitching side is what we're going to focus on today, and we'll do this with lineups. Actually, that'd be kind of fun to do this with lineups as well in the future, which is a little bit harder to do. But in terms of rotations, it's hard to put together rotations right now for this organization, because every level has a lot of talent. There's talent at every level. There's pitchers that are worth watching at every level, and there's guys that might be at an even higher level if there wasn't so much depth ahead of them, right? There's a lot of depth and a lot of guys that need innings and guys that deserve starter innings, right? Because some guys, you can shift to the bullpen, right? That's an option, right? There is going to be some guys from the starters that end up shifting to the bullpen. With that said, there's a lot of guys that you want to give the chance to be a starter. You want to give them every chance they can to prove they can be a starter, and that means having a spot in the rotation. And the reality is you've only got, at most, even if you run a 6-man rotation, which they don't usually in Charlotte or maybe Birmingham, even if you were to run a 6, that's only 24 spots at the 4 minor league affiliates, right? And more realistically, about 22, because typically it's only the lower levels that run the 6-man rotation, right? So we're looking at 22 or so starting rotation spots in the minor leagues, and a lot of guys that could fill that need. I'm going to let you kind of start here, Jeff. Do you want to start at Canny and go up, or do you want to start in Charlotte and head down?
Let's start in Charlotte and head down.
I like that. I was thinking the same thing. Yeah.
And I'll tell you why. I'll tell you how I did it, which is I have a big list of starting pitchers who are either going to be in Chicago or Charlotte. I can't predict if it's going to be Drew Thorpe, Nick Nastrini, who knows, Davis Martin. We kind of have an idea if these guys look in the spring like they did last year, who it's going to be, but that's not going to happen. Some of these guys are going to have better springs and some are going to struggle a little bit. But I've got a list of guys, maybe 10 guys or so who are either going to be in Chicago or Charlotte. How did you approach this?
Yeah, that's similar. What I did was I did kind of like a slash for some of the names in Charlotte, right? I was like this person or this person, kind of under the assumption that one of those two people in certain cases would be on the Chicago roster, right? So I think there's a few guys I have penciled into Chicago. Like I have right now, in my opinion, Sean Burke, Drew Thorpe, Jonathan Cannon as like guaranteed rotation guys in Chicago. I think there's very little chance those three are not in the White Sox rotation to start the year. So those guys are guys I didn't even consider for Charlotte. But then beyond that, there's guys I kind of put in the the few guys I penciled into Charlotte and a few guys I said this person or this person under the assumption one was in Chicago, one was in Charlotte probably. So I can start with mine and then we can work off that if you want.
Yeah,
But
sure.
the guys I had kind of penciled into Charlotte, the way I put it, was Mason Adams, Jairo Iriarte. I think they want Jairo Iriarte to be a starter, and I don't think even after that little cameo in Chicago, he's definitely not ready for Chicago. And if they want him to be a starter, I think he needs a full year of making starts. And then Jesse Schultens. I know that's a name that may have kind of fallen off the radar a little bit, but Jesse Schultens is a guy that I think is going to start in Charlotte because he's going to be working his way back of surgery, whatever. He was with the White Sox for a while in 2022 and 2023. I do think they're going to give him a chance to be a rotation guy in Charlotte, at least to start the season. It's going to be hard for him to crack the White Sox roster out of camp just because of the pitching talent. So those were the three kind of locks I had. And then I put Nick Nastrini / Kai Bush, with one of them making the roster in Chicago. I think one of them could crack the roster. I think it might be a bullpen role. I could see a world where they both make it in Chicago and one's the 5-starter, one's in the bullpen. I don't know exactly how to gauge where those two are at, to be perfectly honest. So I put one spot for those two guys as a combined spot, one of the two. And then the last spot, I put a free agent because I do think I put free agent / Jake Eder, but I do think Eder is sooner than later going to move to the pen, in which case I think there's always going to be one or two veteran kind of minor league depth guys that get signed and end up Tuki Toussaint, for example, those category of guys. So I have that last spot penciled in for a free agent / Jake Eder, with Jake Eder kind of in my eyes being shifted into a bullpen role soon.
Did you mention Davis Martin?
Chicago. I think I have Davis Martin in Chicago. I really do.
Yeah.
I think he did enough last year to get that last starting rotation spot. I think right now, as it is, I think he would join Thorpe, Cannon, and Burke in that Chicago rotation, honestly.
Yeah. So I only have one addition to the Charlotte roster, and that's partially because he did well in Birmingham, but also because there are just so many guys in the lower levels, and that's Tyler Schweitzer. I think he may be in Charlotte right out of the
Interesting. I thought about it. I will get to where I have him after this, but I definitely considered that actually for that last spot. So that's interesting. If there's not a minor league free agent that's brought in, I do think there's a very good possibility that he could get that last starting spot in Charlotte. But the rest of that was the same for you?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And Schweitzer made 16 excellent starts in Birmingham. So
yeah. I think that's a really good thing, and I'll talk about him when we get to be him too. For me, because I still have him in Birmingham, but
yep.
I think Schweitzer is, based on the type of pitcher he is and the progression of his career right now, I think he's the first arm from my Birmingham group that I think will reach Charlotte because of where he's at with his development. Because he's a left-hander, he's the control-based guy, right? Like it's not as much. I don't think there's as much for him to do in Charlotte, in Birmingham, pardon me, to prove that he's ready for Charlotte. I think he is frankly almost there, and I don't hate the idea about you actually that he could beat it in Charlotte because of all the depth. Because we're going to talk about it too. But I mean, Birmingham is loaded. That team is I'm in that rotation. I was writing it and I was getting excited writing it because I was like, oh my god, that could be as good as, if not better than last year in terms of like a watching value, right? Like there's a chance that rotation is even more electric than last year's Birmingham was at the beginning of the year. So that's what I had. In terms of that Charlotte group, what would you say your trajectory of guys moving up to Chicago among that group would be? Because it's a little hard to gauge in my opinion.
Yeah, I think it's almost impossible to gauge because, like I said, you don't know who's going to show up with a sore shoulder, who's going to get out of the gate
Very
a little slow. I think it's just almost impossible to predict.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's going to be tricky. I think if they're pitching well, I think Nastrini and Bush, because they're already on the 40-man now, would be the early, let's add those guys, right? Like I think that's the early decision, but both those guys have a lot to prove in terms of their command, especially. I think they're both kind of in a make or break situation right now as if they want to be a starter, right? I think both those guys could really succeed as a reliever. And again, that doesn't have to be some negative connotation. I think we've talked about that before. Like a lot of these guys are going to be relievers and a lot of them could be really good relievers, right? But I think those two still are viewed as starters, but it's got to happen this year, right? Like you got to see that step. You got to see them develop that command, find a little more consistency. And I think both of them showed good signs last year, but if this is going to be the year, if they're going to be starters in the major leagues, they got to do it this year. So I think those two are the first two up, but I think Mason Adams is right behind. I think Mason Adams is going to be a guy that's going to be in Charlotte. And if he's fully healthy and he looks like he did most of last season when he was before his injury at the end of the year, I think there is, we'll see. I think there's a real world where he's up in May or June, depending on the way the rest of the rotation shakes out.
No, I agree completely. If he continues the trajectory he was on last year, he'll be there quickly. So fingers crossed that's the case, because it was an exciting story.
100%. What do you see with Jake Eater? Where are you at with him? Because I've gone back and forth, but I ultimately I just think he could be a really good reliever, and it's frustrating. Obviously, you want to see him be a starter, and that was the hope when they traded for him. I think his arsenal, and I think the way he pitches could really play up in a relief role, and I'm not sure I see it coming together as a starter. And I think he's even another step behind a Bush and a Nastrini, who I just said it's already make or break for them, right? So where does that put Eater,
Right. Yeah, I'm afraid I have to agree with you. I mean, I think don't you think he'll get a chance to keep his starting position, but probably is destined for the bullpen?
Yeah, I think so. I honestly think there's a chance he just is in the bullpen immediately, just because there's so many starters. But I think he'll get a shot at that fifth starter in Charlotte type of spot. But he's on the 40 man. He's already been on the 40 man for a year now, right? So he was on the 40 man this past season. If he's going to be on the 40 man and he's with the results he showed last year, like, I think you just have to try and get the value out of him the way you can at this point. And that could come from him being in a relief role. And this is a left-hander who, when he was before his injuries and his surgeries, he was up to, high 90s, right? At one point, right? So if you let him empty the tank, if he strengthens up this offseason, he comes in throwing 98 with his breaking ball, right? Like, that could be a really solid left-handed reliever for you. Yeah. So, I feel like you almost have to start to lean into that already this offseason, but I'm not sure.
And you know what? If Jake Eater starts in the bullpen, it doesn't mean he can't transition to the starting rotation.
Right. Who knows? Garrett Crochet, right?
Garrett Crochet, Exhibit A. Absolutely.
100%. Yeah. That's a great point. I think these days more than ever, there's more ability for relievers and starters to be fluid compared to how it used to be, right? So, let's not be afraid to say, hey, you fit better in the bullpen right now, right? But, that doesn't mean you're locked there forever. And honestly, I wouldn't be shocked if that happens with Iriarte. I think there's a world where Iriarte gets to Chicago as a reliever this year, and then they still try to keep him as a starter in his bag, kind of, right, in the future, right? So I could see it going either way, but I think that rotation is going to be just about the guys we talked about. Okay, so you don't have Tyler Schweitzer in your Birmingham rotation. So why don't you start with your Birmingham rotation that does not include Schweitzer? Because mine does include Schweitzer.
Okay. I'm going to start Birmingham by talking about someone who is in the bullpen, and that's Peyton Paulette. I don't.
Interesting.
We talked about whether he gets moved back into the rotation. I think he proved that he's deadly out of the bullpen. So I think that's where he's destined.
Okay, you do think he's staying in the bullpen?
Yes.
Okay. I thought you were going that he was going back in, because I kept him in the bullpen as well.
Yeah. But the guys I have there, I've got Riley Gowans, Noah Schultz, Juan Corella. I've got Johan Dominguez there, basically holding a spot for Hagen Smith or Grant Taylor.
Okay.
And because I have Hagen and Grant starting in Winston-Salem, I've got Shane Murphy and Lucas Gordon in Birmingham.
Okay, so very interesting, because we're really different here. The top three, I think, are a lock. I think Schultz, Gowans, and Corella are pretty clearly going to start in Birmingham. They finished there last year. They all looked great. So I also had Schultz, Juan Corella, and Riley Gowans. I think those three are pretty much guaranteed to be in that Birmingham rotation. My next three, though, it's interesting. You went you went more aggressive with Schweitzer and then less aggressive with the other two that I have. I went Noah Schultz, Juan Corella, Riley Gowans, Tyler Schweitzer, and I went with both Hagen Smith and Grant Taylor. I can see it going either way. I definitely see your logic. There's two ways it can go in my eyes. One way is that it goes what you're saying, and they both start in Winston, and they take that Noah Schultz approach, where it's like, hey, show us 5 starts in Winston, and then you're going up. Noah Schultz went up in May last year. He barely stayed in Winston for very long, right? Like, he quickly went to Birmingham. I could definitely see that. I could also see the organization just saying, you know what, screw it. These are our 3 best pitching guys in the organization. All 3 of these guys are absolutely electric. Let's just throw them in the same rotation and see just how incredible they can be together and grow together and learn together, and all that atmosphere of having your 3 top assets be in a rotation together. It could go either way. I could definitely see it being, a month or 2 in Winston for those guys, for either or of those guys, and then Birmingham. But I think there's a world where they just are, both of them are just straight to Birmingham. I think Grant Taylor wasn't great in Arizona Fall League, but he got innings under his belt. Hagen Smith made one start at the end of the year, right? Or 2, what was it? 3 starts? 2 or 3?
I thought 2, one was good, one was not so great.
Yeah, it was either 2 or 3 starts at the end of the year. And then, I could see it. I think those guys, their stuff is too good for single A and high A, right? And it's fine. If you want to give them a few starts in high A and see how it develops, that's totally fine by me. But I just went a little aggressive here and said, screw it. Let's put them both in the rotation. And then I had Shane Murphy listed as my seventh, potential starter if those guys are not there yet. If one of them or both of them isn't there yet, I had Shane Murphy as that last starter there as well. But I think there's a real world where those two are there together, and Birmingham has the best rotation in minor league baseball once again, just like the beginning of last year.
All right. So let's unpack that a little bit. First, let me start with my logic by having them get those half dozen starts in Winston. Yeah. And you're right. It really has to do with Hagen Smith having one not so great start and Grant Taylor kind of, getting hit around a little bit in the AFL. This is just to get their professional legs back under them, and dominate and then move up to Birmingham with confidence.
Yeah, I totally see that logic. I can completely understand that. I think the factor of letting them build up that confidence makes perfect sense to me, but I also know how much of just a beast both these guys are. They're both SEC grown guys. They've both pitched against the top college bats in the country, right? In their college experience, right? So it's like part of me is like, what do they need in terms of confidence that they can't find in Birmingham? And Birmingham is a pitcher-friendly league, right? So like, while it is AA and it's a higher level than Winston, it's a very pitcher-friendly league in the Southern League, and it always has been, right? So I think if you're pushing them a level, but you're putting them at a place where it's generally going to be favoring the pitcher a little more than the hitter, in which case they can get that confidence there as well. So I can see it either way. I definitely can see your logic. But the interesting thing with this rotation is the innings buildup too, because you've got guys. Grant Taylor's not going to be airing it out all the way, right? I think you want Hagen Smith to be making full starts, but at the same time, you also want to be careful. That's your first round pick. He, threw a bajillion innings last year in college, right? Like, you want to take it easy. You don't want to be easy on him, but you want to take your time, right? You don't want to push them too hard. And then you've got Noah Schultz, who is still building up those innings, right? He didn't throw more than 4 innings last year in a single start. He was consistently at 4 innings, right? He was capped there. My guess is this year, they're going to be trying to get him 5 or 6 innings a game. That's for sure. Definitely the plan is to ramp up Noah Schultz. How much you ramp up Noah Schultz, though, we'll see. So I think Birmingham will need 1 or 2 of those piggyback guys, like you mentioned, right? Even if they're not starting, they're going to need a guy like Shane Murphy who can eat 3-4 innings when one of these guys has a short game or their pitch count gets a little too high, right? So we're going to see some mixing and matching there. But then you've also got an absolute dog in Riley Gowans, who is a guy that threw 6-7 innings in almost every start last year, right? So that helps a lot. And then you've got a Juan Corella, who at the end of the year in Birmingham started to look like that as well. And if Tyler Schweitzer is still there, which I had, even though you didn't, that's another guy who just really churns out innings and did last year as well. So there is so many options. I think no matter what, at some point, I'd say no matter what mid-season, we're going to get that Schultz, Smith, Taylor trio there, and that is going to be incredibly fun. In addition to guys like Gowans and Corella, who are also very good in their own right as well.
So I'm just checking to see how many starts Gowans made. He made 13 in Winston and 12 in Birmingham. So he may be headed to Charlotte sooner than later.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. I think he's the first one from that group. I think, even though Noah Schultz was dominant and as dominant as you can be in Birmingham, I do think the innings ramp up is going to keep him there a little bit longer just to get his arm built up before because Schultz is a guy like you don't really need to spend much time in Charlotte. I don't really see Schultz spending any time in Charlotte, maybe a few games here or there. I don't think there's a need to have him in Charlotte for long at all. So I think with Schultz, you're going to build up the innings in Birmingham before you feel comfortable bringing him to Chicago sooner than later. I think once he leaves Birmingham, even if he does go to Charlotte, it's month max. So I think with him, it's going to be patient. Smith and Taylor, I actually don't even think either of them are going to debut this year. I think there's a chance they debut this year with the Sox because they're just so talented. But I think the way this team is trending, you don't need to push it. And there's so many other arms that I think you can just kind of plan those guys and pencil them in for 2026 and work from there, in which case they'll spend the majority of their season in Birmingham. So I think the staff will actually stay fairly similar compared to last year with those 3 at least. And I also think Corella will probably spend most of the year there, if not all of it. I do think he could probably get up it because he is on the 40-man. He had to get added before the Rule 5. So I think with Corella, because he's on the 40-man, you could see him get moved up. But really Gowans and then maybe Schweitzer, if he's there, are the 2 that I think will be in Charlotte sooner than later for sure.
What are your expectations going forward for both Murphy and Corella?
Murphy's an interesting one. I don't think Murphy is necessarily a guy you're penciling in as a big league piece. I think he's command and he eats innings and he does a good job, but I think ultimately it's like a long reliever. I think that's probably more of like a depth, long relief bullpen type guy. Corella I like a lot, but Corella is a fascinating case because Corella has shown some signs of like, oh, this guy could be a legit starter. And he's also shown sometimes of like, oh, this guy could be great in a late inning bullpen role. So it's interesting with Corella. I think with him, he's young enough still where you want to let him keep starting all season. But I could see a world where Corella shifts into a bullpen role sooner than later, probably not sooner, a little bit later down the road, and becomes a really good reliever as well. So I can kind of see both ways with a Corella, but I do want to see him as a starter at least for this year for sure.
Yeah. Okay. So who
where
do you
are you
have?
at with
Who do you have
where are
in
you at with
Winston?
Corella? Sorry,
No.
what do you
I
think
would.
with him?
I don't know. I think he gets a shot in Charlotte. And there's so many factors that will determine who gets pushed to the bullpen.
Right,
What the
100%.
need,
And it
what
never
the
hurts to
needs
have
are in
options.
Charlotte, right? What the needs are in Birmingham. But yeah, I mean, he was one of the few guys added to the 40-man. So that speaks loudly.
Right, 100%. So that'll be interesting to see where that shakes out at that point. So going down, you obviously are gonna have a different rotation in Winston because you've got the top recent top draft picks in Taylor and Smith there. For me, my Winston rotation is Lucas Gordon, who we didn't touch much on because you have him up to Birmingham, but I have him still in Winston. He would be the guy though that I would say would take a spot if a Taylor or a Smith were still in Winston. It'd probably be Gordon that gets pushed to Birmingham in that circumstance. So I think there's a world he is in Birmingham, but I have Lucas Gordon, Seth Keener, Aldrin Batista, Drew McDaniel, Jake Peppers, and Tanner McDougal as the Winston rotation.
I've got all those guys listed there, along with Jake Bokenstadt. Now, keeping in mind that with Smith and Taylor there, I've got 8 starters there, so there's going to have to be a lot of piggybacking. But in this day and time, I don't think that's such a big deal.
No, not a big deal at all. Who would be the guys if Smith and Taylor were there? Who would be the guys that would be the piggybacking guys, not necessarily making starts?
Well, I think Smith, Taylor, Batista, and Keener definitely are starters.
Yeah, they have to be.
And then I think it's for the other guys, it's who takes a step forward, who claims the spot as opposed to who deserves.
No, I agree. Okay, so we touched on Smith and Taylor already. What are the where are you at with some of the other guys? So we'll start with Aldrin Batista because I know we're big fans of Aldrin Batista. He looked incredible last year. When he got up to Winston, he was even better than he was in Canny actually. He looked already like he was capable of handling this high A level. What do you see in terms of trajectory for Batista? Because he's still pretty young and because he didn't make a ton of starts in Winston yet.
Right. Yeah, I think he's going to spend a lot of time there unless there's a need in Birmingham. But I think you're right. There are a lot of guys ahead of him. But, if he ends up in the bullpen in Chicago, that's a deadly arm coming out of that pen. And, of course, he'll get every opportunity to remain a starter.
Yeah.
He's just so impressive.
Yeah, he's so young. I want to see him make a lot of starts this year. He made 22 starts last year. He threw 110 innings, which is really good for a guy that just turned 21 during the season, right? I think Batista is still remains one of my favorite arms in the system. I'm really excited to see what he does next year. I think he gets to Birmingham though. I don't think it's quick, but I do think he's going to spend some time in Birmingham next year. I really do. I think when you see guys like Gowans and Schweitzer and then potentially even a Corella go up from Birmingham, I think you're going to see Batista get that call even at a young age, right? I think he'll spend the majority of the year in Winston. I think that's probably accurate, but I would not be surprised to see a July call up or so for Batista to Birmingham because I do think of this entire group here, aside from Smith and Taylor, he's probably the highest upside guy there of the guys I have in my Winston rotation. So it's like, yeah, he's young, but the dude has done nothing but shove the past 2 seasons. So I have a hard time seeing him not move up later in the season if he continues to do what we know he's capable of doing.
Right. And you're right. We've seen flashes from those other guys, McDougal, McDaniel, Keener, and Peppers, but
right. Nothing like Batista's done so far. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. They're still a tier behind in terms of demonstrating.
I am really excited to see a full season out of Seth Keener, though, because I do really like Seth Keener's stuff. I think this is a guy that can play up for sure at the next level. He was hurt a little bit last year. He had some command issues. He was learning how to be a starter, right? This is a guy who was a reliever in college and is working his way back into being a full-time starter with the organization now. I think Keener could really show a lot this year. And I think now that he's in Winston, he finished the season in Winston. It was a little bit ugly, but I think, now he's ready to be in Winston. He deserves to be in Winston. I think we could really see him take a step up, and I think there's a chance that he ends up being the second or third best arm in this rotation this year if he can kind of find a little bit more consistency with his command, because the stuff was good last year. He generated a lot of whiff. The slider is excellent. And, he's another guy, one of many, right? That like you could shift him to a bullpen role if things don't work. But this year, at least for sure, he needs to be getting starts and a chance to become a starter.
Right. I agree. I'm curious as well what you think about Lucas Gordon, who I guess was a fifth round pick. I think Keener
Yeah.
was what, the second or
Third.
third.
Third, yeah.
And then I'm curious what you think about Gordon and also Tanner McDougal, who was started in
Yeah.
Winston and went back to Canny. He's got a lot of great stuff. He's just still pretty young.
Yeah, Gordon is an interesting one. I think Gordon, he had a really good year last year as his first year. I think he's further along in his development process than some of these other guys we mentioned. I do think Lucas Gordon is a guy that I'm not sure I see like the high end upside with. I don't know. I still am not sure I see him as a legit long term starter, but he has the starter mold, right? I mean, he throws strikes, he commands the ball well. He had really good numbers last year, right? He's not going to make a ton of guys miss, but he's going to give you consistent innings. He's not going to. He had a little bit of a walk problem actually last year, but he limited contact well for sure. I mean, only 70 hits allowed across 113 innings last season, so very good at limiting the amount of contact he's giving up, pitching around guys, making things happen. I think he's a good starter, and I think you're going to keep him in a rotation right now, whether it's in Winston or maybe even in Birmingham, right? But I do see him a little more along the lines of like a Tyler Schweitzer-esque guy, where he's a good pitcher to have in your system. You feel good about the chances of him being a big leaguer, but do you feel good about him being anything more than a 5-starter? Probably not. But at the same time, like, he was great last year. Like, continue to prove me wrong, please. If his command can tick up a little more, right? Like, he's going to need to have good command, though, for his type of pitching to be successful, right? So, like, this is a guy who doesn't give up a ton of contact, but also did walk a lot of guys last year and didn't strike out a ton. So if you're going to be a, pitch to contact type of guy, you're going to have to command a little better. So I think if his command can tick up, then we might see him as, a really good overall, command pitch to contact guy, but he's going to have a little bit more consistency with his command in order for that mold to kind of fit him.
Yeah, I think it was kind of a rough transition for him to Winston last year.
Yeah, a little bit, but he settled in quickly. It really was. I mean, he was pretty good overall, and he ended up still, he still had really good numbers in Winston, a 2.81 ERA across 9 starts in Winston.
Okay.
But 27 walks to 32 strikeouts is not really going to fly at the high A level, and particularly at the double A level especially, right? So got to see where that command goes. If he's going to limit contact, he needs to also be strong with the command as well. So I think Gordon's in a decent spot. I'm excited to see what happens. And then McDougal is a fascinating one because, like you said, the stuff, man, is legit. I mean, we saw him in the playoffs, in the single-A playoffs for Kannapolis, and he was lights out. This is a guy that was just exceptional. He started the year in Winston, though, so the expectation this year is he's back in Winston, right? He went down to Canyon for a reset. He needed to kind of figure some things out. He should be in Winston. He kind of has to be in Winston this year, right? He already started in Winston last year, so you really can't start him in Kannapolis. I don't think it makes any sense to start him in Kannapolis. You kind of have to start him in Winston. And this, even though he's young, considering he was drafted at 18 years old, this is becoming sort of a make or break year for him as a starter, because I think it's similar to Peyton Pallette, obviously different because he was a high school draft pick, whereas Pallette was a college guy, right? But I think McDougal now is at the point where it's like, we got to see this stuff translate into consistent starts with better command, or else we got to look at a bullpen role for him because there's so many starters and because his stuff is really good. So the stuff being really good, it's got to come with more command, and it's got to come with a little more consistency and confidence of the way he's pitching.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, it's going to be fun to watch for sure.
Yeah, one of many guys. I mean, it's gonna be interesting to see what happens. Let's go down to Kannapolis. This is our last rotation. I think, considering we're pretty aligned now of who we had at the 3 levels, I think we should have pretty similar guys. The thing about Canny that's fascinating is Canny's always kind of a toss up because there's guys coming from the ACL, there's guys coming from the whatever. I mean, there's going to be guys coming from everywhere. So I don't really know exactly how to predict the Canny rotation. I think we're going to see 15 different starters there at some point this season. It's just going to be a mismatch. It's going to be some guys coming up. I mean, there's some other guys where I'm like, I haven't heard anything about, like Matthias Lacombe, who was a draft pick out of France. I have no real idea of where he's at right now. I think there's like a ton of question marks right now. And then you've got the 2024 draft guys where it's like, you got to get innings for your 2024 guys who are starters in college that need those starter type of innings. So the majority of who I have here is the 2024 draft class. But I think there's going to be a lot of other names infused into here that are going to get starts at some point. I'm just not sure when they're going to get starts and how that's going to shake out. So who did you have as your rotation as of now?
Well, I'm like you. I've got probably 10 different names, and that's excluding free agents they're going to sign, guys from the DSL who they think are ready, who I have no idea who those guys are. But yeah, I've got, the draft picks, Justin Sinibaldi and Mason Moore, Carlton Perkins, Ricardo Brizuela may still,
Me
they
as
may
well.
still keep him around for a starter. Tommy Vale, could be in the rotation if they need him. And you're right. Matthias Lacombe, Christian Apor, Blake Larson, Liam Paddock. The list goes on as to who we may see there.
Yeah, that's you. You named everybody that I had for the most part. Nick Pinto's the only one I heard that I didn't hear from you, and Cleet Hartzog as well. Those are the two others that I had in addition to everybody you just said. The actual rotation that I had written down was, again, this is such a toss up. I think of all these, I think most of these we're going to be pretty accurate on. I'm hoping. I think we know our stuff for the most part, but this is the one where I could see any combination of 6 of 12, 13 guys that could combine into the 6. I had Brizuela, Mason Moore, Nick Pinto, Justin Sinibaldi, Cleet Hartzog, Liam Paddock, and then Christian Opper. Those were the 7 I had as like my official rotation. But again, this one's a toss-up. It's hard to know. Blake Larson, I believe, is coming off an injury, so I do think, and he's super young, so I think Larson will definitely be in Arizona still to start the year. I don't see a world where he's in Candy to start the year. I'm pretty sure he's going to be in the Complex League for at least a few months, if not more, probably most of the season, actually, just considering how raw he is. And then there's a few others. Yeah, you mentioned Perkins. I don't really see Perkins as a starter. Tommy Vale, I think, is just so. I mean, he's an undrafted guy, but he's 24 years old. I think Tommy Vale needs to be in a bullpen in Winston, probably. That's my guess with him. I think he could be one of those piggybacks in Winston, probably. But I think it's mostly 2024 draft guys that I think will start there. I mean, it's what we saw last year, right? We saw Lucas Gordon and Keener and Peppers and all those guys start the season there, and then they moved up slowly, and I think that'll be similar, right? But I do think this will be mostly, the draft guys with Brizuela there as well. I think Brizuela will be kind of that opening, that lead starter and the experienced guy in the Candy rotation. I think he's had a really good year in Candy, but is not quite ready for Winston yet, and there's a lot of guys ahead of him, as we've talked about. So I'm interested to see what these draft guys, though, because there's a lot of these, college 4-year or 3 4 or 5 year experience college guys from schools all over the country, right? There's a lot of guys that are interesting, but I wouldn't say there's anybody, obviously Hagen Smith is the exception. I wouldn't say there's anybody in this group that really jumps out as like super high upside right now. So I'm really curious to just watch them because I haven't got to see enough of these guys. Like I've read about them. I've talked to a bunch of these guys. Like we talked to a bunch of them in Kannapolis, right? Like that's all good stuff, but I want to just watch this rotation and get to learn about these 2024 guys. Cause I watch video and I do my reading and stuff, but I am excited to actually see them in Kannapolis and watch all these 2024 draft guys pitch.
Right. And you're right. A lot of these are big time college arms who should do well. I mean, our expectation is they're going to do well in Kannapolis, just like Gordon and Keener did. Do you think there's any chance that some of the relievers in last year's draft class, and I don't know that much about them, Phil Fox, Blake Shepardson, Pierce George, Jack Young, do any of those guys get turned into starters?
I don't see it. I think there's a possibility. I think Shepherdson's one that I could see maybe. I think his stuff is good enough, but I think for now, because there's so many arms, I think George, Shepardson, Young, I think those guys are going to be relievers. I think they're going to be relievers that can move aggressively. I think all those guys will start in Kannapolis, right? I think maybe Phil Fox could be a starter. I could see Phil Fox transitioning into a starter. I think his fastball is good enough where Phil Fox is a fastball heavy guy. He's got a ton of induced vertical break. He's known for a really, really nice riding fastball that he threw almost 80% of the time in college. I think Fox is a guy that maybe could be a starter. But generally, I think there was a lot of relievers taken, and that's not a bad thing. I think they'll fill out the bullpen. I think the Candy staff is just going to be fun to watch because you're going to have, 10 guys from a single draft class pitching and either starting or relieving for that team, which will be really cool to see those guys develop together. It'll be kind of the breeding ground, right? In addition to that Candy lineup, which we'll talk, we're going to have to make that our next episode. We might as well, right? But that Candy lineup this year is going to be fun. I am very excited to watch the lineup in Kannapolis this year, and even in Winston too, because I think some of the guys will progress. But I do think there's going to be some young talent in Kannapolis that's going to make that lineup extremely fun to watch. Like I think there's a world where that lineup is like the most fun lineup of all these lineups. So the pitching is going to be a lot of mixing and matching, but a lot of fun arms and a lot of guys we are excited to get to know. Meanwhile, the hitting is going to be really young and really exciting down there, I think.
All right. So as much as I'm dying to talk to you and pick your brain on some of the hitters' assignments,
we're going to save it.
I'm going to reserve it. We'll talk about that next week. But I do want to talk about one reliever and where you think he starts, and that's Aaron Combs, because man, he was deadly last year in the playoffs, and he is a big time stud.
Yeah. What I will say is not Kannapolis. That's what I'll say.
Yep. Could be Birmingham.
There is a world. There is a real chance Aaron Combs goes straight to Birmingham. Honestly, I think this is a guy that was, the closer for the College World Series champions last year. He's got the stuff. He closed out the playoff games for Kannapolis. There's a world he goes straight to Birmingham. He probably starts in Winston. Man, maybe screw it. Maybe they put him in the Grant Taylor. I think he almost is in that same Grant Taylor, Hagen Smith bucket where it's like he could go to Winston for a month or two with those guys and then get confidence and go to Birmingham. Yep. Or they could just screw it and send him straight to Birmingham because his stuff is good enough. So I think Combs is a guy that definitely not Kannapolis. There's no way after what he did last year down there that he needs to pitch there again. Like he made hitters look ridiculous in Kannapolis in those handful of appearances. I mean, he was just simply better than every hitter he faced there, I think, which is not common. But again, he pitched in the College World Series and saved the College World Series, right? So it's like, I think he's Winston, maybe Birmingham.
Right. And again, not only did he pitch well, but I mean, we're talking high leverage games. I mean,
for sure.
All these playoff games, I mean, it was a lot of pressure and he came through 100%.
Yeah, I think he's at least Winston and maybe Birmingham soon, at least for sure. Well, that was cool. That was really fun. This is getting me fired up for minor league baseball. It's only December and I wish it was April already. So that's how it goes when you follow prospects and you get into this stuff. And, we're going to have this stuff covered. I think for everyone that likes listening to our Sox content, right? Like I'm just waiting for the Crochet trade. And I know everybody hates that and people get mad at me for saying that. And it's like, whatever. I know people don't want to trade him and they wish they would extend him. And like, again, I think it'd be awesome if the White Sox extended Garrett Crochet. They're not going to. That's not happening, unfortunately. I don't think Crochet is signing an extension with the White Sox. I think he's ready to move on and go play for a contender as well. He might not say that, but I do think he's ready and I think he's prepared for it. So let's get some prospects. I'm excited, Jeff. When that time comes, we're going to try and find the soonest time to schedule a podcast because that's going to be exciting. That's my stuff. I've been researching every single team that's been in on this Crochet stuff. Right now, based on the hearings of the last week, I think it's between two teams. I really do. And I said this when we did our mock trades a few weeks ago. I think it's the Red Sox and I think it's the Cubs. I really do. I think those are the two teams that are going to make the strongest offers for Crochet. There's this weird 3-team idea being floated around between the Cubs and the Mariners and the White Sox. Sure, like fine. I'm cool with that. I mean, I like the Mariners prospects a lot as well. I think the Mariners and Cubs are two of the best fits in terms of, I mean, I like both those teams prospects a lot. It would be Crochet doing the Cubs. It'd be Nico Horner going to the Mariners. And then it would be a variety of prospects from both going to the White Sox with an Owen Casey probably being the headliner coming from the Cubs. I don't mind it. I don't mind it at all. I like the idea. I like Owen Casey a lot. He was the headline prospect in my proposed package for the Cubs. I like the Mariners pieces as well. If the White Sox can get a package centered around an Owen Casey and a Cole Young, I'm here for that. I'm very here for that. Cole Young is a impressive contact speed middle infielder. He would be up in a year or so probably. He's probably a 2026 major league guy. He could be maybe this year, probably not. He's probably a 2026 major league guy. Owen Casey's an immediate starter in right field for the White Sox this year, opening day probably. It's fun. I like that idea. So we'll see what happens on that front. But I do think we're going to have some exciting stuff to talk about soon in terms of Crochet. We're going to get to predicting lineups, I think. We just kind of made our next episode by doing this episode. So yeah, we're gonna be back sometime soon. And we hope you all stay tuned with us on the roundup here, Jeff. It was a good time.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. And after that Crochet trade, we might need to bring in the big guns and get Aram or Jack.
Yeah. No, it might be. It might be time for that. That's a pretty good idea there for sure. All right, Jeff. Well, I will talk to you next time, and we'll see you all.